There were three fundamental requirements to give you a hope at success. Number one, you couldn't look Jewish. And in Poland, that meant a lot. Poles, as a Slavic people, tend to be blonde, blue-eyed, light complexioned. That does not go to describe Jews. And you had to have the perfect nose. My mother had it all. My mother was blonde, light complexion, blue-eyed. The next thing was language. You had to speak a perfect Polish. The majority of Jews in Poland lived separated. It was a voluntary de facto segregation, and Jews spoke Yiddish, not Polish. They spoke Polish for business, for connections and so forth, but very often the Polish would be accented with Yiddish. My mother came from a reformed, very assimilated home. Polish was the language of her home, and she went to Polish schools, so no problem. The interesting thing, which I never thought of asking my father, Yiddish was the language of his home, but the children did not go to Yiddish schools. They went to Polish schools. They went, like our Jewish children here, went to Hebrew school after school to be schooled in Judaism and what have you. And my father was fluent in Hebrew, as well as in Yiddish, of course. But he went to Polish schools, so he spoke a perfect, unaccented Polish. Poland is a very devout Catholic country. Remember I said my father managed my grandfather's general merchandise store? The major or key merchandise in that store, Catholic religious items. Crosses, medallions, pictures of all your saints. Who were his customers? Poles and priests. And in Poland, Catholics to this day, I'm told, have a greeting formula. It's usually, "Blessed be Jesus Christ," and the response is, "For centuries and centuries, amen." It's a formula. If you're a member of the tribe, you know it, and if you're not, you don't. Having gone to Polish schools on my mother's side, and my father, that contact through the school, they were quite familiar and comfortable in a Catholic setting. So that certainly helped. My father had the connections about getting housing. He learned that there was a detached single-family home further out towards the country from where the factory was. Suburban, but not in a fancy center. It was a one-bedroom, large kitchen, an attic and a cellar. No electricity, no running water. There was a well out front. And my father got permission. My aunt and uncle could hide in the attic or in the cellar, where my father installed a Franklin stove to keep it warm. In the summertime, they could be in the attic. There was a skylight that you could open to get some fresh air. No running water, which meant there was no indoor plumbing. They could not use the outhouse, but we managed. Except that within a month, my cousin's cover in the convent was blown. A way that nuns made money for the convent is they did embroidery and sewing for the townspeople. Someone from Przemyśl came to pick up something, and she saw my cousins. And absolutely adamant. I know these girls, they're daughters of a very prominent Jew in town. There's no way they're Catholic. So having nowhere to go, they came to us. So now we are hiding 4 people. Besides the fact that you have to hide 4 people, you have to feed 4 more people than you have rations for. And you can't buy more than you legitimately could use. So you have to make sure that you don't buy too much from any one person at any one time, so as not to arouse suspicions, you're very constricted in having visitors, because although my mother was draconian, the hidden people had to be hidden. They had to stay out of sight. They came downstairs to the main floor for the night, but during the day, they had to disappear. Initially, people complied, but if you read Anne Frank, you see how initially people are very grateful, and eventually it sort of gets old being second-class citizens. So the atmosphere in this little house started getting a little tense and less than cozy and friendly. One morning, my father's at work, 2 policemen show up. We have this letter that we need to talk to you. And my father freezes. And fortunately, Alfred was in the office, says, well, why don't you speak to the owner? Alfred tried everything possible to diffuse their focus. They were not giving up. No. And they finally says, look, let's just cut through the chase, let's call everybody in, have them drop their pants, and we'll know what's what. Well, by that time, my father got his wits back together again. And he said, well, let me point out that we work here on 3 shifts. And we don't know in what shift your alleged suspect is. If he's not on a day shift, he'll get word of what's going on and he'll leave. So why don't you allow me quietly investigate and I'll get back to you. And they accepted that. So they gave him their business cards, okay, you investigate and get back to us. Victor was nervous because this is dangerous. After a few days, he decides to investigate. On his own, he goes to the police station to find out what the status is, and one of the agents there says, oh, the captain wants to talk to you. Now, Victor's really nervous. He walks into the captain's office, and it turns out they're old hunting buddies. Years before the war, they were in the same hunting party, and the captain just asks him, do you employ a Jew? And he says, of course not. Well, I just needed to ask you the question. Crumples the letter and throws it out. Luck and good people. Because of the position my father had and the employment, the business of the factory, on a quarterly basis, they had to go to Krakow to meet with the German authorities where they would get the assignment for the next production. And at one such time, travel started to become dangerous even for Poles, because as the Germans started running out of Jews, they started picking on Poles, because they did not exactly love Poles either. At this particular time, there were rumors of frequent roundups, just sporadic, unannounced roundups in the streets. So my father and Victor travel to Krakow. They have their conference, and as they're about to leave, my father says, maybe I should get a certificate that we were here on an official business. And Victor laughs at him and says, oh, you're always worried. That makes you happy, go ahead and get it. Which he did. They're on the train, almost back in Lublin, and Victor laughs at him. See, people just talk. We're almost home, there's no problem. Except that when the train stopped in Lublin, the train is surrounded by SS, and everybody off the train and register for Majdanek. At which point my father approaches the man in charge, produces his certificate, and says, well, why don't you use the army's exit? And the driver who was sent from the factory to pick them up said they were the only people who left the station. Luck, definitely, but also thinking things through and so forth. The street we lived on was perfectly straight and very long, and you could see for quite a distance if someone was coming. Of course, everybody was walking because there was no other transportation. And as my brother opened the door, he sees a car of the SS stopping across the street and the SS coming out. And he has the presence of mind to quickly shut the door and sound the alarm. Germans are here. And so a cavalcade starts running up to the attic on the ladder. My uncle is still on the ladder when the Germans are pounding on the door. To cover the noise as he finishes climbing, my mother yells back, pretending she doesn't know who's knocking, saying, "Oh, what's the racket?" You know, the way a mother normally would if there was unexpected, unjustified noise, until she hears German police, by which time my uncle finished climbing the ladder. The provision had been made for such an eventuality that my uncle, the last one up into the attic, would pull the ladder in, slide that wooden plank that covered the opening to the attic, and he arranged some sort of a closing mechanism from the inside. There was no time for that. There was no way he could pull up the ladder. So he just slid that wooden plank covering the opening and stood on it as my mother opened the door and the Germans came in. They checked her papers, they checked the cellar, they checked the bedroom, and then they asked, "And what's upstairs?" And my mother, she says, "I don't know. When we moved into the house, that was stuck permanently. And since we didn't need the space, we didn't bother to have it forced open." And one of the Germans actually climbed up on the ladder and tried to push it open. With my uncle fortunately standing on it, it resisted. And they let go. Luck. Nearing the end of the war, as the Russians were approaching, my father brought to Lublin his sisters and found jobs for them, except for his oldest sister, who was joined in the hidden people. She had two daughters. One had a job nearby as a housekeeper and could occasionally visit. The youngest daughter lived in town. She was a very good seamstress, and so that's how she survived. In our early days in Lublin, in that rooming house, there was a family like us. One Jew recognizes another Jew, and my father stayed in touch with them. They lived in town also. And so for my aunt to have contacts with her in-town daughter, they would write letters and use that family's address as a depository. They didn't want to use the post office, so there wouldn't be that track. My father very frequently had to go to town on business, and so he would either drop a letter off with that family or stop there to pick up a letter from my cousin. The men in that family looked Jewish, did not speak a perfect Polish. And yet he felt he had to go out and he had to jabber. And my aunt kept harassing my father. It's been a long time since she didn't have a letter from her daughter. And the day that the men went to the barber's, talked. And as he got up to leave, he was picked up by two blackmailers who followed him home. That was the day my father went there to pick up a letter. That's how he got picked up by blackmailers. And so I was on the street, and I see my father coming. As I said, it was a long street. You could see for a long distance my father's coming home between two men. And his head is hanging, and he's red. And I ran in the house to tell my mother that he's coming with two men. And my mother understood. And so shoot everyone away. And my father tried to bribe them. No, they were not giving up. They came, they took whatever valuables they could find. They took his gold watch, they took his fur coat, number of valuable things, and left. sort of saying, well, if you don't say anything, we won't bother you again. With the approach of the Russian army, it was dangerous for business owners to remain in town. And so the brothers moved to Warsaw and left my father in charge. But one day, Alfred was coming back with some other people, and my parents were going to have a dinner for them at home. My father was at work, my mother was in town, and she was going to shop with the ladies, and my aunt and cousins were going to fix the dinner and prepare. And I'm, of course, out on the street playing with my friends. And I see two men walking into the house. My mother had packed her most precious, valuable possessions in 2 suitcases. So should we ever have to leave at a moment's notice, well, it was all ready for them. And I see the men leaving with the suitcases. And I went in search of my brother to tell him, I said, hey, you've got to go to town and alert our parents of what happened in the house. And so he went to town, he found my mother, but she was surrounded by people and he didn't say anything. So my parents returned home. In the attic, when it was built, a couple of bricks were left out. So there was a constant incoming of fresh air. And as a signal, my parents put a spring and put it in that opening. And the idea was, when you come home, check that window. If the spring is there, means the coast is clear. If it's removed, means it's danger. Don't come in. My uncle was in the attic. He knew what had happened downstairs. And he's in the attic and he's watching out that little window, and he removed the spring, and he sees my parents coming and he notices that they're not looking. And as they're about to enter the house, he sticks his arm out and absolutely freaks my parents out, who then go in search of us, and we tell them what happened. Well, knowing that the coast was clear, they entered the house. The Blackmailers had imprisoned the women in the cellar. They told my father, no, don't open it, don't let us out. They said we had to wait till the Gestapo comes and gets us. The fearfulness, the mentality of people who don't have to be brazen and face the outdoors, the everyday danger, but who just live in this isolation. These men took everything. They even took the pajamas my father had slept the night before. With the Germans expropriating businesses, the company my father was working for was going to be expropriated. And my father delayed as much as he could, and then the final deadline was July 31st, 1944. No more appeal, it goes over to the Germans once my father was going to lose his job. Well, the Russians walked in July 24th. Timing couldn't have been better. There were bombardments, and so my brother got sick as a result of it. There was a high-level employee in the factory, rabid anti-Semite. He would brag to my father how before the war, neither he nor his wife would enter a store without first ascertaining that it wasn't owned by Jews. And he was palsy-walsy with my father. How much does it matter who you are rather than what you are? He was the one who arranged for us to stay with a farmer's family in the countryside when we started getting bombardments, and when he heard about our blackmailing experience. To protect us, why don't you go to these friends of mine in the countryside, they'll take you in. We were in the countryside. I was with my mother, taking a walk with the farmer's wife in the fields. We suddenly see a cloud of dust on the horizon. And the women understand the Germans are running away. And we formed a circle and we started dancing, singing, the Germans are running away, the Germans are running away. My father came to visit us, to join us over the weekend, And that's when someone told us the Russians have walked into the city. And my father couldn't believe it. And when he saw the first Russian soldier, invited him in for a glass of vodka. And the soldier said, "Oh, my captain loves vodka too." So I said, "Okay, bring your captain in over too." When my father re-entered the city, he said that he saw the two blackmailers shot dead in the streets. So they were preying on other people than us who got their revenge. We remained Catholic as long as we remained in Poland because it was too dangerous to be Jewish. Many Jews were killed after the war by Poles who were outraged, saying, "Darn it, we thought Germans had taken care of all of you." My uncle in America knew that we were surviving on Aryan papers. My father's younger sister's husband was one of the few who managed to cross the border just at the beginning of the war. It took him a year to walk to Palestine. The two uncles communicated as to who had survived and where they were. My parents thought they could come to the United States as soon as the war would end, but there was a high quota. We had a very high number. But France was very generous. Western European countries were much more willing to allow refugees to come in for a brief period of time. We got a visa to France. We were under one name and one religion in Poland, but our travel papers were in our Jewish names and Jewish religion. We left Poland, we went to Czechoslovakia, and that's as far as a train would take us because the trains going to France were going through Switzerland, and there was nowhere Switzerland would issue even transit visas on a Polish passport. And again, my father found out that there was an airplane going from Prague to Paris with 3 seats. And he said, I didn't count because I was so small and so skinny, I would be on his lap. And in those days, I was acceptable. And so in February 1946, we arrived in Paris. And we stayed in France till we came to the States in 1952. My husband is a radiologist, and he was hired by UPMC to start up the ultrasound laboratory part of the radiology department. It's human nature always to have somebody to look down on or to blame for your problems. And I see a very dangerous parallel here, and the danger in particular is the denial. My grandson says, well, I haven't felt any anti-Semitism. You gotta wait until you feel it? Can't you hear? Can't you see what's going on, what's being said? This stirs me all the way around that as human beings, we seem to be incapable of learning. Unless we experience something directly on our skin, we just don't accept it. That's scary. I was sort of forced into talking about it through a friend of ours who was my children's Hebrew teacher when they were in 4th grade. And she used them to prevail upon me to talk about it. I would talk to children, and I would usually talk, from a child's point of view. This is how it was growing up, the way I had to grow up, not the way you're growing up. "15 years ago, there was a gentleman who was going to talk about his wartime experiences, and he was Danish. And I said, what do you have to complain about? So I had to go and hear him because I was just curious. And he said what to me was a decisive statement, that Holocaust deniers were growing and increasing in numbers while survivors were dying off. And I looked at myself and I said, I'm among the youngest, and I'm not so young anymore. So if the world needs to know that it was real, it happened, and how it affected people and how people survived differently, then I needed to step up to the plate. And since my husband had been nagging me for years that I should write up our story, I finally did it. People should hear it directly from people who experienced it, who lived through it, to believe that this happened. It was real, and how it happened and why it happened, in the hope that it will not happen again.